There is a moment in every major conflict when the decisive blow has already been struck, and almost nobody realizes it yet. It does not always come from a missile. It does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like stillness. 300 armored vehicles sitting motionless across two fronts. Engines cold. Crews waiting for fuel that is not coming. A military built on speed and maneuver, suddenly, completely unable to do either. That is the situation analysts are now working to understand. And the question that matters is not whether this happened. The question is how it was engineered so completely, so quickly, and why almost no one in Washington had a ready answer when the scope of it became clear. To understand that, we need to go back, not to the moment the strikes began, but to the strategic logic that made them possible. Every modern military force has what planners call a center of gravity, not a building, not a weapon system. A center of gravity is the source of power that everything else depends on. Remove it, and the force does not simply weaken, it loses its ability to function as a coherent fighting unit. For a mechanized army built around armored maneuver, that center of gravity is not difficult to identify. It is fuel. Without it, a tank worth several $1 million becomes a steel enclosure that cannot move, cannot reposition, and cannot participate in the kind of dynamic warfare it was designed to fight. What appears to have occurred across a 96-hour window is not a conventional military campaign. It is a logistical interdiction operation, one that targeted not soldiers or weapons, but the invisible system that makes those weapons capable of being used. And here's what is strategically important about that framing. It changes everything about how we analyze what comes next. Let us start with what is confirmed and what remains in the realm of reported claims, because the distinction matters more than most coverage acknowledges. What is confirmed is that significant disruption to Israel's petroleum supply infrastructure has occurred. Israel imports the overwhelming majority of its oil. Estimates consistently place this figure above 90%. That structural dependency is not new. It has been a known feature of Israel's strategic situation for decades. Military planners on all sides have modeled it. What appears to have changed is the operational willingness and demonstrated capability to exploit that dependency at scale. What is reported, though not fully independently verified, is the specific scope of simultaneous targeting across multiple import and distribution nodes. The narrative emerging from regional sources describes coordinated strikes on port petroleum infrastructure at Haifa and Ashdod, interdiction of the overland pipeline route through coordinated Houthi pressure on Red Sea approach lanes, and precision targeting of the fuel distribution network that connects national reserves to forward-deployed military units. What remains uncertain is the precise operational condition of Israel's strategic petroleum reserves, how much buffer exists, how rapidly it is being consumed, and whether emergency supply corridors are being organized in ways that have not yet been publicly reported. These distinctions are not minor. They determine whether we are analyzing a temporary operational setback or a structurally decisive shift in the conflict's momentum. But let us work through what a complete severance of the petroleum import system actually means for a military force in active operations, because the physics of this are not widely understood, and they explain why Washington's response has appeared so constrained. A main battle tank is a fuel-intensive machine. At operational tempo, moving, engaging, running all onboard systems, fuel consumption runs at several hundred liters per hour of active use. A full fuel load provides a limited operational window before resupply is required. In sustained combat operations, resupply happens continuously. Convoys move fuel forward. Forward fuel points distribute to individual units. The system functions because the flow never stops. Now trace what happens when you sever the flow at its source. The tanks continue operating from their existing onboard fuel. The countdown to immobilization begins immediately. It runs at a rate determined by how aggressively the force continues to operate. And here's the brutal operational logic. The pressure to maintain high operational tempo does not disappear simply because fuel is running low. If anything, battlefield pressure creates incentives to use fuel faster at precisely the moment conservation is most critical. The result, if the reported scope of supply disruption is accurate, would be precisely what we appear to be observing: a progressive immobilization of mechanized forces across multiple sectors as fuel reserves are consumed without replacement. But let us go one level deeper, because the targeting logic described in early reporting reveals something analytically significant about how this campaign was apparently designed. Fuel supply systems, like most logistics networks, have redundancies. If one import terminal is disrupted, operators adapt. They redirect volume through alternative pathways. They draw down strategic reserves to compensate. They improvise distribution routes. A military logistics system that has absorbed decades of planning for exactly this kind of contingency does not simply collapse because one node is struck. What the reported campaign appears to have understood is that redundancies only function when they are sequenced. Strike one node, the system compensates. Strike all nodes simultaneously. The system has no fallback to reach. This is the difference between a conventional strike campaign and a systems disruption operation. The targeting logic was not designed to destroy as much infrastructure as possible. It was designed to destroy the specific nodes whose simultaneous elimination would prevent any compensating redistribution from occurring within the operationally relevant time window. That is a meaningfully different level of operational thinking, and it raises questions that Western strategic analysts are clearly wrestling with now. Because there is an intelligence dimension to this that deserves analytical attention. Targeting a distributed fuel distribution network, one that includes not just major port infrastructure, but regional distribution depots and forward fuel points, requires detailed current knowledge of how that network actually functions in wartime conditions. Which routes are active, which facilities are prioritized, which nodes are critical and which are redundant. Building that target database takes time. It takes sustained collection, and it suggests a surveillance and intelligence preparation period that predates the current operational phase by a significant margin. Early indications suggest that what we are watching is not improvised. The pattern is consistent with long-term preparation, a systematic mapping of an adversary's logistical architecture followed by a carefully sequenced targeting campaign designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that mapping revealed. At this stage, we cannot confirm all elements of that picture. But the operational outcome, if the reported scale of immobilization is accurate, is consistent with exactly that level of preparation. Now let us address the dimension of this situation that is generating the most visible concern in Washington, and examine why the American response has appeared so limited relative to the scale of the reported development. There is a tendency to interpret constrained American responses as political reluctance. Sometimes that interpretation is correct. In this case, it may be missing the more fundamental issue, which is operational. The most direct compensating action available to Washington, aerial fuel resupply to forward-deployed Israeli units, runs into basic arithmetic when analyzed at operational scale. Military airlift capacity, even at maximum sustainable sortie rates using the largest available platforms, delivers fuel quantities measured in millions of liters per day. The consumption requirement for a large mechanized force at operational tempo is measured in the same units. The arithmetic does not favor airlift as a solution. It can slow deterioration marginally. It cannot replace destroyed import infrastructure or reconstitute a severed distribution network. The naval resupply option, routing petroleum tankers to Israeli ports under military escort, faces a different problem. If the port infrastructure capable of receiving bulk petroleum deliveries has been significantly damaged, the physical system for offloading that fuel does not exist in a functional state. A tanker can reach Israeli waters and still have no viable means of completing the delivery within any operationally relevant time frame. Direct military action against the assets that executed the interdiction campaign carries a different category of risk, one that involves escalation pathways with consequences extending well beyond the immediate theater. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most consequential choke points in the global energy system. Any escalation that threatens its operational status introduces economic consequences at a global scale that constrain American options in ways that have nothing to do with military capability. What this means strategically is that Washington is confronting a situation where the most obvious response options are either operationally insufficient or carry costs disproportionate to the benefit. That is not a comfortable analytical conclusion for any administration to reach, but it appears to be the operational reality. Let us now consider what this moment suggests about the broader strategic picture, because there are patterns here that extend beyond this specific conflict. History offers several instructive parallels for what effective logistical interdiction can achieve. During the Second World War, the Allied strategic bombing campaign against German fuel production, targeting synthetic oil plants and fuel distribution infrastructure, is widely credited by historians as one of the most decisive factors in limiting German armored and air operations in the conflict's final phases. German tank production continued. German aircraft continued to roll off assembly lines. The fuel to operate them stopped flowing. The weapons became strategically irrelevant. A more recent parallel, the 1991 Gulf War, demonstrated the inverse logic. Coalition air power systematically disrupted Iraqi logistics and supply lines before the ground campaign began, ensuring that Iraqi armored forces were degraded before they could be effectively employed. The lesson absorbed by military planners globally from that conflict was that logistics is not a secondary concern. It is a primary target. These parallels should not be pressed too far. Historical precedent does not map cleanly onto current circumstances. The actors, the technologies, and the strategic context are all different. But the underlying principle that a military force deprived of its operational fuel cannot fight regardless of the sophistication of its weapons is not historical. It is physics. What is analytically new in the current situation is the precision and simultaneity of the reported targeting approach. The ability to strike distributed infrastructure across multiple nodes within compressed time windows using combinations of missile systems and drone platforms represents a meaningful evolution in what a regional power can execute against a sophisticated adversary's logistics network. and that evolution has implications beyond this conflict. From a strategic perspective, the lesson being observed in Beijing, in Moscow, and in other capitals with an interest in understanding the limits of American power projection is straightforward. A military force that depends on imported petroleum, which describes virtually every significant military operating in the contemporary world, carries a structural vulnerability that can, under the right conditions and with sufficient preparation, be exploited to achieve decisive operational effect without engaging that force in direct combat. That is an important lesson, and it is transferable in ways that will shape strategic planning far beyond the current theater. Where does this situation lead? There are several plausible paths, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the outcome remains contingent on decisions not yet made. One possible scenario involves a negotiated pause, driven not by military defeat in the conventional sense, but by the operational reality that the current force posture cannot be sustained without a fuel supply that cannot be quickly restored. In this scenario, diplomatic activity intensifies, and the terms of any settlement reflect the military facts on the ground rather than pre-conflict assumptions about leverage. A second plausible scenario involves emergency reconstitution efforts, improvised supply corridors, emergency procurement, and partial restoration of distribution capacity that allows some operational continuity even without full infrastructure repair. This scenario extends the operational timeline but does not resolve the structural vulnerability unless the destroyed infrastructure is rebuilt, which is measured in months rather than days or weeks. A third scenario, one that carries the most significant risks, involves escalatory action by one or more parties that broadens the conflict in ways that introduce consequences currently outside the analytical frame. This scenario is the least predictable, and the one that most analysts would assess as carrying the highest potential for outcomes that no party involved actually seeks. There is a dimension of this situation that I want to address directly because it is easy to miss in the analysis of operational details. The apparent restraint embedded in the targeting doctrine, the choice to immobilize rather than destroy, to strike infrastructure rather than personnel, to achieve operational effect, while limiting the kind of imagery that generates maximum international pressure, reflects a strategic calculation that goes beyond military planning. A campaign designed to produce mass casualties would generate a fundamentally different international response than a campaign designed to produce operational paralysis through infrastructure targeting. Industrial fires are dramatic. They are not the imagery that historically triggers the most intense pressure for intervention. This suggests a strategic sophistication, the simultaneous consideration of military effectiveness and political consequence across multiple audiences that deserves analytical acknowledgement regardless of one's views on the political dimensions of this conflict. The 300 immobilized vehicles that appear to be at the center of this situation are not, in any battlefield sense, destroyed. They are simply stopped, but stopped in the context of an active military campaign that depends on their ability to maneuver, is operationally equivalent to destroyed for as long as the fuel system cannot be restored. What is operationally certain, based on current reporting, is that rebuilding destroyed petroleum import infrastructure takes months, not days. Reconstituting a decimated fuel tanker fleet takes weeks. Establishing alternative distribution pathways at the throughput levels required for large-scale armored operations is not achievable within the conflict's probable timeframe. What is operationally uncertain is whether emergency measures, international assistance, or improvised solutions can provide sufficient partial fuel restoration to allow some operational continuity. That uncertainty is real. It is also the uncertainty that Washington's emergency response efforts are now focused on. Whether those efforts can move fast enough and at sufficient scale to change the operational picture before the strategic shift becomes irreversible is, at this stage, genuinely unclear. What is clear is that we are watching a moment that is likely to be studied for years, not because of the scale of destruction involved, but because of the strategic logic it demonstrates. The most enduring lesson may be this: in an era of precision-guided munitions, long-range drone systems, and deep intelligence preparation, a military force's logistical architecture may be as decisive a target as its weapons systems. The tanks that cannot fight, the aircraft that cannot fly, the force that cannot maneuver, not because it was defeated in battle, but because the fuel that makes mechanized warfare possible was systematically removed. That is a strategic outcome that required neither numerical superiority nor direct engagement to achieve. The Middle East that exists in the aftermath of this period, whatever form that aftermath takes, will be shaped by the military facts established in these weeks. Those facts are still developing. The decisions being made now in Washington, in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, and in capitals across the region will determine how much of the current situation can be reversed and how much becomes the new baseline from which future negotiations proceed. What we can say with confidence is that the baseline assumptions that shaped strategic planning in this region for the past 2 decades are being revised in real time. The revision is being driven not by diplomatic negotiations or political decisions, but by the operational realities on the ground and by the fuel gauges of 300 armored vehicles slowly reading empty. The story is not finished, but its direction has become significantly clearer than it was 96 hours ago.